Hello, everybody. Welcome to another wonderful session of Tool Time Tuesday. I know you've missed it last week. We didn't have it, but we're back this week, and we're going to continue talking about those pesky commas. 13 comma rules to make you a better writer, part 3. Okay, so I saved the hardest ones for last. We just have 2 rules to talk about today, and they have to do with something called a clause. So my first question is, what is a clause? Now I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking Santa Claus, right? Well, you have to get Santa out of your brain because when it comes to writing, a clause is not Santa, but it's rather it's a grouping of words. Clauses can be what are called dependent or independent, and clauses are the building blocks of sentences. They are everywhere. So first, let's talk about the difference between independent and dependent clauses. Before we talk about that, though, we have to review 2 important words that you'll need to understand. The first word is dependent. If you're dependent on something, it means to rely on something else and you're not able to function or it's not able to be functioned alone. So, for example, you are dependent on your parents right now for food, clothing, and shelter, and your basic needs. You really can't manage to live your life happily without them right now. Independence, on the other hand, is when something is able to stand alone and function all by itself. It doesn't need anyone. It does it all alone. It can stand by itself like grown-ups do. For clauses, the idea of functioning alone means to make sense by itself. So in other words, if it's a dependent clause, it really doesn't make, the grouping of words doesn't make sense all by themselves. They kind of need the rest of the sentence to clarify their meaning. An independent clause, it's like a big kid clause. It can totally stand on its own, almost like a grown-up. Okay? Now, a little bit more about dependent clauses versus independent. Dependent clauses cannot stand alone in meaning without the rest of the sentence. In order to make sense, they are dependent on the other half. They need the other clause in order to be a complete sentence. Independent clauses, on the other hand, are clauses. They're complete sentences that can stand alone in meaning. They don't need the other clause to make sense to the reader. They can stand in meaning on their own. So now that we're clear on clauses, now we can look at rules number 12 and 13. So rule number 12 is we use commas to separate independent clauses. And how we do that is we use a comma before what's called the conjunction that joins 2 independent sentences. Now, I don't know if you've talked about conjunctions when you were in elementary school, but conjunctions are words that join 2 independent clauses. It's when you want both of the ideas to be put together in a sentence because they definitely affect and clarify meaning for the reader. The most common conjunctions are for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Those are often referred to as fanboys. I didn't make it up, but it's just what those conjunctions are called. It's kind of like an acronym to help you remember the 7 most common conjunctions in the English language. When you have a conjunction joining 2 independent clauses, you have to put a comma ahead of the conjunction. Okay? Now that rule is very simple, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Oh, did I miss one? Oh, here it is. Here's our examples of independent clauses when it comes to using a conjunction. Here we have a sentence. Rebecca wants to learn to play the guitar, but her guitar has only 2 strings. Now, what's underlined are 2 clear sentences by themselves. They're enough to stand alone. They make sense all by themselves. But the writer wants to put them together because they definitely kind of support each other in meaning. So the first sentence is written, Rebecca wants to learn to play the guitar, and then, comma, but her guitar only has 2 strings. But is the conjunction, and but is joining these 2 sentences together because the reader wants you to understand that Rebecca wants to learn the guitar, but she really doesn't have a good guitar to learn on. So that's why the reader wants to keep these 2 together. And notice the comma after the first independent clause, then you have the conjunction, and then you have the second independent clause. Here's another example. James dreams of becoming a rock star, so he rehearses every day. Here are clearly they're two independent clauses. These two sentences can stand on their own. They have a subject and a verb, they make sense, but the writer wants them together so that you understand that James has a dream of becoming a rock star. But so, what does he do about it? He rehearses every day. And right ahead of the conjunction, here's where we place the comma. Okay? That's rule number 12. The opposite of that is rule number 13. That has to do with dependent clauses. Now, remember what I said about dependent clauses. Dependent clauses are clauses that really need the rest of the sentence to make sense. They can't stand alone on their own merit without the rest of the sentence because the meaning is just not clear for the reader. And in that case, you use a comma to separate a dependent clause from the rest of the sentence. These almost feel like a side note of added information, but they are not able to stand alone without the rest of the sentence. Let's look at how that looks. Here's an example. The sentence reads, running through the woods, I tripped on a log and scraped my knee. Okay, so clearly in red, this is what's called a dependent clause, because by itself, it makes no sense. If I just said to you, running through the trees, and that was it, your first question would be like, what about it? What happened? Who's running through the trees? When you have those kind of questions with a phrase, you know the phrase is a dependent clause because it needs this part to make sense. I tripped on a log and scraped my knee. Oh, so this is what happened. This running through the woods just tells what had happened or why it happened. And because I want to add that information, I add it, but then I have to put a comma after I add it so that it separates the dependent clause, comma, independent clause. But you see how they work together to help clarify the meaning for the reader? How about this one? The window, comma, cracked from the cold, comma, needed to be replaced. Now here, the added dependent clause is inserted in the middle of the existing sentence. The sentence by itself, the window needed to be replaced, is totally clear on its own. However, if you just said cracked from the cold, that sentence is not enough by itself. It's dependent on the rest of the sentence to have meaning for the reader. So you're just clarifying what happened to the window and why it needed to be replaced. Well, it was cracked from the cold. That's what this is doing. It's helping you understand why the window needed to be replaced. When you insert a dependent clause in the middle of a sentence, you have to put a comma after the subject and then insert your added information, your dependent clause, and then another comma to let the reader know that you're all done, and then you're bouncing back to the rest of the main independent clause, independent sentence. Okay? Here's another example. The snowstorm, which was the worst of the year, made driving terrible. Right here, the dependent clause is inserted right in the middle of the sentence. By itself, it's not enough to stand. If you just simply said which was the worst of the year, that would have no meaning for the reader. But when you add it with the snowstorm, comma, which was the worst of the year, comma, made driving terrible, now we see that the dependent clause is helping us understand why the drive was so terrible, because the snowstorm was the worst of the year. So when you add a dependent clause, you need to put a comma right ahead of it and then right after it, unless it's at the very end of the sentence. But if it's inserted in the middle like these are, you need to offset them with commas. Here's another one. My neighbor, comma, who lives in a tent, comma, values the preservation of our environment. So again, here we're inserting an idea about your neighbor. It's kind of like that side note. You're trying to add some information about your neighbor. You want to put a comma after the neighbor subject, insert your added information, your dependent clause, put a comma to let the reader know you're all done, and then you bounce right back to the main point of the sentence. This is just clarifying that your neighbor lives in a tent, kind of to hammer home the point that your neighbor values preservation in the environment and obviously doesn't like electricity or any other modern amenities and wonderful things we have. Okay, so the final thought is that although they might be a bit pesky and seem to pop up everywhere, These little buggers are a very important tool in making our writing more clear and organized for the reader. Just think of them as the written pauses that naturally occur when we are verbally speaking to other people. When you're writing, you guys, say your sentences out loud. Your ear will naturally hear where pauses or commas should be used. So a lot of kids don't do that. Is when you guys put things in writing, stop and say what you write out loud. Oftentimes where you pause, where you would naturally want to take a break or pause or like let the reader digest what you're saying, you would use a comma. We do it when we speak, but you guys forget to do it when you're writing. So therefore the words get all jumbled up and there's no pauses and the meanings get lost. Okay? So I have an awesome worksheet that follows this for practice. And I know you're going to get really good at using commas. Hopefully you learned a lot today about independent and dependent clauses. You will see those a lot as you grow up and get into upper middle school and high school. So hopefully you got a little taste of them today and you're able to do your practice worksheets. Have a great day.